So do you think there are any lessons we could take from the 1970s that we could apply to today's situation?
Lessons in the sense of,
Fiscal mismanagement, social irresponsibility, and things of that nature.
it's hard to see lessons the when what you're dealing with is the breakdown of a system.
Uh,
And the system broke down in the 1970s, and the system broke down, in 2008, 2009. It's easy enough to point fingers and say, well, the system broke down because of such and such, or there was an inadequate regulation or something like that. That doesn't help you get through it, though. I mean, it's one thing to know about the villains, and there are villains in the most recent story. Um, but how you pay the bills is another matter. I mean, I think the only thing that's a positive sign is that in 2008, 2009, the federal government seems more willing to intervene than it did back in the 1970s.
uh,
Um, there's that famous newspaper headline when the mayor goes down to Washington D.C. and appeals for help, and President Ford says, drop dead, according to the New York Post headline, or the Daily News.
Yeah.
I've forgotten which one it was.
today.
Um, that's not happening, and that's, I think, is a very positive sign. But whether the present bailout is going to be enough to get us through that kind of storm, I don't know.
Um, Also during the 70s, there was a ongoing debate about whether programs such as social welfare and things should be cut in order to balance the budget. And one side of the argument held that yes, we need to cut those in order to balance the budget, or else we're going to keep running a deficit and cripple the economy for good. And the other side of the argument was that at a time like this, where people are lacking jobs, if you cut those services, there's going to be riots and chaos out in the street. What side would you agree with, based on your experiences during that time?
Well, um, I don't know. I think anytime that a government cuts back on basic social services, it's running a real risk. It's playing a very fine game. I don't hear the kind of debate today that took place back in the 1970s, where people are saying that there are simply too many people on the welfare rolls, people who are lazy and unwilling to work. I mean, because it's very clear that all over the country there are people who are being thrown out of work, and in that respect, this is a lot closer to the Depression of the 1930s than it is to what happened in New York in the 1970s, because it really is. It's a national or even international crisis, and I don't recall, I'm not an economist, but I don't recall that in the 1970s we had quite that sense that we were dealing with a really big problem. I mean, the 1970s I vaguely remember as a much more localized kind of crisis. New York and maybe a handful of other big cities, but not certainly a national problem, and definitely not something that had deep international repercussions. So this is in that sense a much worse kind of problem to deal with, and I don't think as a result that you're going to get much traction if you're going to argue that the problem is going to be solved by throwing people off the welfare rolls. I mean, that's just clearly not an issue this time.
Mm-hmm. But back then, would you say it was?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of talk about that, but I don't even recall that as people advancing that as an explanation for the crisis. It was more something that we had to get control of in order to get out of the crisis.
All right. What made New York City different from like all the other cities, and why was it specifically New York City and only a handful of other cities that experienced these kind of problems?
Well, look, I mean, New York is a lot bigger than all the other cities in the United States, anyway. And I think, although I can't prove this, I think New York City had since the early part of the 20th century, a long tradition of progressive social responsibility. I mean, it just had, New York had a much longer, deeper, stronger tradition of collective responsibility for things like health, education, welfare, that sort of stuff, and that New York has. I mean, in many ways, the New Deal of the 1930s was a national version of what had been going on in New York for already for decades. Not only New York, I mean, you could probably add Chicago and San Francisco in there, but New York, of course, is twice as big as those places. So that when there was perceived to be a need for some sort of retrenchment, that impacted New York much more severely than other cities.
All right. So I think I basically asked most of the questions I wanted.
Okay.
Like, any final words on how you feel about the, like, how would you state the era of the 70s? Like, what characterizes the era of the 70s? That would be my final
I mean,
question.
apart from disco?
Yeah. Well, you can talk about disco too if you
Disco.
want.
Yeah, blame it on disco. I mean, what was in the 70s? In fact, I just flashed on this for the first time. There was a guy who got thousands of people to come to, was it Wrigley Field in Chicago, for a disco burning thing, and people brought
Wow.
all their records, and they burned disco because, I mean, it was kind of a goof, but the idea was that, you know, the whole problem with the country was disco. I'm not remembering that very clearly, but I do remember that. So yes, you know, there's no more disco, so we can't blame disco for this.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right. So, thank you very much for your time.
Okay.